se, Zoe nidsigasun, nia odapem suesqueo, eguamaga, snanaas, qualicum, niwigan, ginanaskomi tinawal, marsi kakyal, niwakomakanak. So, hello. Today I'm going to talk about fish. Freshwater fish are in trouble. Across diverse watersheds, habitats, and geographies, scientists, indigenous knowledge keepers, and myriad relations are raising the alarm about fish declines across the planet. Today, I will explore how my colleague Amar Khangiser and I are bringing their concept of listening and attunement and our method of fish restoring to bear on questions of how to work ethically with fish as sentient, agential, more than human beings. Drawing on an environmental kin study of bull trout well-being in the Alberta foothills and Rocky Mountains of Western Canada, and Amar's ongoing work with water, fish, climates, and listening in the Pacific, I will examine what listening to fish can offer to shifting the current dominant forces at play that are wiping fish off the face of the earth. Blackfoot scholar Dr. Leroy Littlebear works thoughtfully on relationships between humans and the worlds that we occupy. He has written, presented, and advised extensively on questions of Blackfoot metaphysics, science, education, and governance. Over the years, he has asked audiences to consider the following question, including during a talk he gave at the Congress of Humanities in Calgary, Alberta in 2016, where he stated, quote, "The fish, for instance, nobody's talked about the fish in this Congress, not that I know of. But the fish has been around, think about it, way before the dinosaurs, way before the Neanderthals, way before our time. The fish is still around. I wonder what scientific formula the fish has discovered. We should ask the fish. They've survived." End quote. So how do we ask the fish what they have discovered? Sometimes when I include the above quote in a talk, someone will ask the second follow-up question earnestly, which is, how do you talk to fish? I stumbled for a long time trying to come up with answers for non-Indigenous audiences when they ask this question. But it's only in coming to work with my dear friend and collaborator, Dr. Amar Khangiser, who is a geographer and sound artist who works in the Pacific, that I realized that those well-meaning audience members have perhaps been asking the wrong question. Asking is not always about talking. In fact, I now realize it's not so much about how do we talk to the fish, it's about how do we listen to them. Over the years, I've struggled to translate what for me is a very intuitive and embodied understanding of what it means to listen or talk to fish or other more than human beings. Something that I now understand is shaped by both my Métis worldview, which is itself shaped by my own family's experiences and relationships to Cree homelands throughout the North Saskatchewan and Lake Winnipeg watersheds, and also by relations and obligations that I hold as a Métis person to both Cree and Métis legal orders. But this is also shaped by my neurodivergent brain. Ever since I was a little girl, I had an intuitive sense that I could, in a very broad, ephemeral way, listen to the fish. But translating this concept across time, space, onto epistemologies or worlds or cosmologies and disciplines is a completely other matter. The Globe and Mail, which is a national newspaper here in Canada, featured an opinion piece this week that defended catch and release fishing as a strong and ethical conservation method, one that I myself have participated in throughout my life. However, there's growing empirical evidence that catch and release of fish for sport can cause significant distress to the fish. In my own work with the threatened Saskatchewan Nelson bull trout population in Alberta, catch and release has been used as a way to help protect species from overharvesting for nearly 40 years. However, a recent study in Alberta conducted by Brian Joubert, Michael Sullivan, and others showed that 33% of bull trout caught and handled for selfies by recreational fishermen die subsequently when released, raising questions about the ethics of catch and release of a species that, according to scientist John Post, has declined as much as 50% in the last 25 years and is now listed as threatened under Canada's Species at Risk Act. Indigenous nations and societies across the country have long articulated concerns with catch and release, as it is understood in certain societies as a praxis that is disrespectful to fish and does not honor obligations formed when a fish chooses, of its own free will, to be caught for food. In my time learning from fishermen in the Nunavut community of Paulatuk during my master's and PhD, knowledge keepers taught me that fish are autonomous, agential beings who decide on their own terms when to be caught. This requires that fishermen treat fish with respect, not just in how they physically handle them, but also in not bragging about catching them or otherwise being boastful. These are important principles to adhere to because they underlie a set of legal ethical relationships and responsibilities between fish and humans. These relationships can also be matters of life and death. The late elder Anya Lysiak reminded me many times while I was learning from her during my doctoral work nearly a decade ago that, quote, "You never go hungry in the land if you have fish." As I learned from my friends in Paulatuk, respecting fish is an important part of human survival. Without fish, life can be much more of a struggle. These principles that I learned about from friends in Paulatuk resonate with protocols articulated in other First Nations, Inuit, and Métis legal orders in Canada that center fish as non-human kin, as relations, and as sentient agential beings. In the same Globe and Mail article advocating for catch and release fishing, the author references a statement from the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs. The article states, quote, "Last year, the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs wrote to the Canadian federal and BC provincial governments asking for a ban on catch and release, stating in an open letter that, quote, First Nations commonly view this practice to be akin to torture," end quote. For many Indigenous societies in what is currently known as Canada then, fish are more than human. Dominant Western scientific framings of fish are as not human and not sentient. This is in contrast to plural non-Western or non-dominant cosmologies throughout the globe that center fish as people, as political agents, as inhabiting rich worlds beyond our own. In my own work, I write about how, in order to work across such divergent ways of understanding the world, we reach a point of translation between fish worlds and human ones, one that we can bridge perhaps through what I call fishy refraction. So, how do we learn from fish, as Leroy Littlebear urges, if we are also navigating Western philosophical and scientific paradigms that still largely frame humans as exceptional in our status as sentient, thinking, conscious, creative, and advanced beings, while these same paradigms and disciplines are still debating the parameters of fish existence and knowledge and asking questions like, can fish even feel pain? These put us at very different ways of approaching questions of how to listen to fish. So part of the problem is that from a Western scientific perspective, fish are not people or subjective beings. They are objective artifacts in the world beyond us. They are perhaps specimens of study or stocks to be managed. They might be intriguing and enigmatic, enough so to drive folks to pursue graduate degrees and lifelong careers studying and managing them. But by and large, to a Western scientist, fish are not people. As scientists, we are not trained to ask whether fish are happy or what ethics they may have developed in their own paradigms and watery worlds. So Dr. Littlebear's question is explicitly a challenge not only to open up Western concepts of consciousness, communication, and sentience beyond the human, but they also invite a different way of engaging with an interlocutor than how many Western academic approaches usually foster. That is, rather than studying fish for empirical data, his question urges us to consider that we might be the student and the fish the researcher. My team, working through our Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, has set out to try and find ways to work across both Indigenous and non-Indigenous approaches to try and listen to the fish and to learn what scientific formula they've discovered, as Dr. Littlebear urges us to do. In doing this work, we're not trying to anthropomorphize fish or to integrate or braid Indigenous knowledge into existing scientific approaches. Instead, we're operationalizing a concept that we call environmental kin study instead of case studies, which is an invitation for non-Indigenous researchers to pay attention to the specific environments that they work in, and, in the words of Amir Khangisar, to listen and attune to the places that we occupy. This is a call for a kind of fish and environmental science that starts right at our desk, our front door, the patio outside our house, the river we drive across on the way to the office, the lands where the fossil fuels are extracted to fuel our flights to conferences as we crisscross myriad Indigenous homelands to report our findings to like minded colleagues. It's an imperative to not divorce our bodies and minds from the places that we occupy as we pursue objective studies of fish as specimens, but rather to remember that we all inhabit fish shaped worlds. In fact, one of the taglines for our projects is "Every part of Canada is a fish place." So, what does it look like to start from the understanding that we exist because of the work that fish and other more than human beings have enacted over epochs, eons, and eras to shape the world as we know it? Keeping Dr. Little Bear's guidance in mind, we're mobilizing fish restoring to draw interlocutors into storied landscapes that freshwater fish move through and animate across myriad Indigenous homelands that we are accountable to. In using this concept, we draw explicitly from the work of Dr. Kutcha Risling Baldi, who draws on the work of Linda Tuhoai Smith, Mishawana Goman, and others to help define her own concepts of revitalizing, renaming, and reclaiming through story work. So, in her own study of oral traditions and trickster stories within her community, Dr. Baldi states, quote, "By rewriting and revitalizing these oral traditions, stories like those featuring Coyote are able to unsettle the knowledge we take for granted as universal and call into question ideas of objectivity, truth, and fact, some of the very building blocks of Western epistemologies," end quote. So ultimately, we are working in conversation with decades and generations of scholarship on stories, storying, and storytelling that came before us. And in arguing for a fish restoring method, we hope to help instruct settler scientists specifically in what it means to approach story work ethically, accountably, and across lifetimes. So rather than study fish, we consider that perhaps the fish are also studying us, and that the stories that the fish weave us into have power to reconfigure the current weight and heft of relationships in and across many ecosystems. And so, in doing this, we're learning the specific cues and nuances and obligations and reminders that are embedded in each place. And this disrupts the urge to universalize fish as specimens and stocks, and instead recognize their work as relations. In turn, we hope that this will open up ways of approaching complex questions that all of us are grappling with in the face of ongoing environmental, social, and political injustices here on Earth. So, as Dr. Little Bear says, we should ask the fish. They've survived. Ginanas Gomitin, thank you.